Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, December 5th meeting of the Cluster API subproject for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. I want to start today's meeting by just announcing, I don't know how widely this was disseminated, but Paris sent out an email saying that there was a security vulnerability in Zoom and that everyone should please update to use the latest client so they don't have the problem. I think it affects Mac, Windows, and Linux. So you can just go into Zoom and say check for updates and make sure you have the latest one there. And I put a link to some more information about the security vulnerability into the notes if people are interested. All right, so to actually kick off the main content of the meeting, Vince has an agenda item about webhooks. Vince, do you want to talk about webhooks?
Oh, it looked like Vince has actually made it with us. So
I'm actually on the run to get home. So if you guys want to talk about something else, just
okay.
Later.
We'll put you at the bottom of the agenda and we'll come back. Excellent. All right, so I stuck a couple of things onto the agenda as I was going through and triaging issues this week. I closed a number of issues and there were a couple I thought might be worth talking about. So the first one was number 43, which was putting more automated checks in the repo. So things that we just like automation to take care of so that we're not sending PRs to fix little things, that we catch them before code gets submitted. Some of these things I think got taken care of during the migration to CRDs. Like whenever you run make now, it runs go vet for us, which is really nice. And I think people have been sending PRs to take care of a couple of the other ones. So Alvaro sent a couple of PRs that I think took care of a couple of them as well. And let's see, Alvaro just updated this 18 minutes ago, saying that there is an outstanding PR that he linked to. And then after that, all we're missing is Go format checks to verify that they don't break. Does anyone else have any context on this issue or want to mention other things that they would like to see us add automation for that we should put under the same umbrella? What are smelling checks, Justin? You have to give a little more context.
Finding spelling checks.
Is there a good spell checker we can put in?
There's one which we use in KK, which is good at not doing false positives. It isn't particularly. It misses a lot, but it doesn't do a lot of false positives.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. Does it mostly check comments and documentation, or is it also looking at your variable names?
I think it's a mixture of all of them. It still misses a lot, but I think it tries to look at everything. I think. But it only, what it does is it actually has common misspellings rather than, so it will be like, well, smelling is obviously a word, but annoyingly it doesn't have Kubernetes, which is the one I always do, but it will have other common typos.
What's the name of the tool?
I will look it up right now and put it in chat.
Okay. Oh, ASPL, okay.
Well, I think that's one that Chris Nova said that they used on a different project. I don't think that's the one that's necessarily being used for KK. Chris, and if you're talking, you seem to be muted.
The cluster autoscaler uses misspell, which seems to work nicely. I don't know anything specific, but it doesn't have false positives, quite a lot of them.
We used that on our previous open source project to misspell. So, I mean, I don't have any opinion for or against these. But misspell seemed to work pretty good for us.
Yeah. But it does sound like people are in favor of having something to help us correct common misspellings. If people have been using them on previous projects and other parts of the Kubernetes ecosystem use it, it seems like that'd be a good thing for us to put in place as well. Yes, Daniel pointed to another tool which helps us verify that we aren't ignoring errors, which is a great thing. That's something I always look for in code reviews, is to make sure we're not either assigning errors to underscores or calling functions that return error and just not catching the value. That would be nice. Cool. So So Justin, can you go update not just chat, but also the issue with a link to the spelling tool that we use for KK, and maybe also put some links to the other tools people are putting in chat. And then Daniel, can you update the issue and put a link to the error check thing as well? And then also, if people want to help add any of this automation to the repository, that would be great. I know Alvaro has been adding some of it. I don't know how much bandwidth he has to add the rest. So if people are excited about helping us do this, that would be a great contribution, and I think a pretty easy thing without having to necessarily understand in depth any of the code itself. Right? So I think this is already marked as sort of a good first issue or good new contribution, but that doesn't mean that somebody who's already contributing shouldn't also feel inclined to take it as well. And Steve mentions in chat that he might be able to help out, so that would be great.
I'll add one more tool, but I think this tool will probably be better run on the provider repos. That's security scanners.
There's a particular one that you've used in the past?
We use gas in the past, but I've heard recently that there's a better one. So I don't really have any opinions.
Why do you say that'd be better to run on the provider repos?
Because we build the cluster CTO, and that's I guess you can run it on the controllers too. I guess.
I think because in the main report we're producing those build artifacts of the machine tech controller and the machine deployment controller. And, so I think it would be useful to run against those also.
So Nadir mentioned in chat that for the AWS provider, we're using Golang and Golang CI lint, and part of the enable checks that we have there are a spelling checker and a GoSec as well. So that might also be another option.
Cool. Yeah, I think also if you guys wanted to help push that into the upstream and maybe show people how to set that up in their provider repos, that would be really helpful too. If you guys are already getting those things running and sort of paving the way there. Awesome. So next, I stuck a link to Justin's PR, number 599, to add local defaulting. This, I think you sent this like a week or so ago, but it came up recently because I saw another PR that looked like it was trying to fix a similar issue in a different way, and people are sort of running into issues because of the lack of defaulting that we have today. After our switch from aggregated APIs to CRDs, we lost our code that did defaulting, and this PR adds it back. So I wanted to, before LGTMing it and getting it in, to bring it up in this meeting and make sure there weren't any concerns with adding defaulting in our controllers, which is what the code does, because CRDs don't yet have a mechanism to do defaulting themselves, as far as I understand.
So if I understand correctly, the current way that defaulting is expected to be handled with CRDs is through mutating webhooks. Is there a benefit to this approach versus using the webhook-based approach, Justin?
The benefit is that it's faster, it's easier, and that I think we could use the same code is the hope. To like bound the expectations on this, like I originally just hit the couple of things that I was hitting personally, and then other people like Alvaro, I don't actually know how to pronounce your name, I'm sorry, but like gave me a link to like the existing code, and Chris or Krigel like, gave me like some pointers as well. But right now it only does machine deployments. It doesn't do machine sets. It doesn't do validation. I feel like it's a quicker first step. And then if we want to do a webhook, we can do that we can move that, hopefully the same function just called from a webhook. But I sort of get personally annoyed by having to specify everything.
I think, Jason, to your question, though, also, my understanding is with CRDs, we're supposed to be able to get basic validation and potentially basic defaulting through schema definitions, and more complicated advanced defaulting you'd have to use a webhook for. So ideally, we wouldn't have to write a mutating webhook to do simple things like it should be set to 0 by default, right? which is, I think, part of what Justin's PR does. That sort of thing, I think we should at some point get for free from CRDs through the schema. Say, set the number of replicas. If it's not set, put it at 0. Like, I think that's going to be a pretty common thing for CRDs to not need a webhook for. Hopefully.
Yeah, but there's some things that we can't do or will never be able to do by a scheme. For example, the deployment strategy details. And then what I just wanted to quickly add regarding the webhook, it's the better approach, but I tried it out like 6 weeks ago with what Kubernetes offered back then, and I hit a set of issues. So it's probably easier to just start off with having it in the controller.
Yep, that sounds good. The only reason why I was asking is that overlaps a little bit with Vince's topic for later.
I was going to say there is a deeper philosophical question as well, not philosophical, but like about, maybe that's what Vince's one is about, which is there is actually a difference between setting an optional field in the API object versus observing that the field is not set and defaulting the value in the controller, because it's sort of saying that when we leave the field as nil, it's sort of like, is it omakase, where it's like whatever the controller thinks is the recommended value, like that could be interpreted that way. Whereas once the field has the default value of today's default value of 1, there's no way to know whether I actively wanted 1 or at the time when I created it, someone set it to 1. So we've used that in COPS. I haven't seen it used a lot in other projects, to my knowledge. It definitely helps with evolution. Probably not as much in the current values, but there is a difference which we've found useful in the past in COPS land.
So the difference is basically, if unspecified, controller should do best practices based on the current controller code, which may change over time, right? The best practice may change over time. Whereas if you actually do defaulting, then the defaulting value gets inserted and the controller must then respect that value because it can't tell if the defaulting code put it in or if the user specified it.
Exactly. And so as a concrete example, for example, suppose you decided that anonymous auth on API server was no longer safe today. So the default previously might have been anonymous auth true, but we decide in future anonymous auth should be false unless you actively do that. So that's the sort of thing where the distinction matters.
Is that something we can do in like a mutating webhook also, and say, when you get a new version of the controller, the mutating webhook is now inserting a new default value, or do you think that is more surprising to users because they actually see the values in their objects?
Well, we wouldn't know for existing objects, would we? I guess that's the...
Yes, yeah. For existing objects, you'd still have the old values, but I think that's actually not bad either, because if you have an existing object and then all you do is change your controller binary for that behavior of that existing object to change, is also kind of surprising to users.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be like COPS did this, but like the way we did that in COPS is we would key those changes off a Kubernetes version. So with the move to Kubernetes 1.15, like that flag would magically change, or the default for that flag would magically change.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So it wouldn't just say the next time I run my reconcile loop, I'm going to redo everything with the new best practice values. It would be when I make some other change where you might expect things to be shuffling around anyway, like I'm upgrading your control plane, then I would reshuffle things to the new default values.
That's how we did it. I mean, maybe there would be circumstances in which you decide something is critical enough, but that's how we did it.
Okay, I think we should. Sorry, hit mute. I think we should circle back to this when we get to Vince's topic. I don't know if Vince has made it home yet. So let's keep turning through the other parts of the agenda. So next one is cluster autoscaler, cluster API backend. Looks like there's a pull request to the autoscaler repo linked here.
Yeah, that's me. Just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Olaf. I work for a hoster in Berlin, Germany, and we provide managed Kubernetes to our customers, including the machine controller and cluster API and the autoscaler. And what we've done here now is to just provide a cloud provider for autoscaler so that it uses the machine controller and the cluster API, the machine deployment controller, to scale up and down machine deployments automatically for node autoscaling. Yeah, and so we've it works on our cluster pretty nicely, and the pull request is linked. And maybe if some of you guys could read this or have some comments on it, would be nice. I'm thinking we didn't have any major problem. Well, one problem we did have, or potential issue, is that it would be nice if there was some cloud independent or technology independent provider set, like the machine set, machine deployment provider. What's the name? The provider spec, which contains the provider, the cloud specific, the cloud configuration for new machines is always providers or cloud specific. So this makes it impossible, basically, to implement some part of the autoscaler in a cloud independent way. So is there something planned to provide a technology independent provider spec in the future?
Yes, so I think we've been having a number of conversations with the autoscaling folks that maintain the autoscaler. And back when we started the Cluster API project, probably about a year ago, we sat down with them and wrote up a sort of a list of requirements that they gave us from their end to make the autoscaler be functional on top of the Cluster API. A couple of those things don't exist yet. I don't know if you've seen the support for machine classes go in. I think that machine classes is a big part of it, because machine classes is a way for us to represent the sort of the template for a machine set that the autoscaler can look at, and we can promote the pieces of information out of the provider specific fields in a way that the autoscaler can read them across environments, right? So things like, number of cores, amount of the machine that's, memory and cores reserved based on, what version of Kubernetes you're running, et cetera, right? So I think the idea was that the autoscaler needed to parse the common bits of the machine class to understand what the node it's going to create is going to look like. And then the other big missing piece we have is the autoscaler, when it's scaling down, needs to be able to delete a specific machine from a machine set. And right now there's no way to do that. You can change the replica count, but it will delete a random one. And there have been a number of proposals on ways that we can implement our API to allow the autoscaler to delete specific machines. So I think, in my mind, those are sort of the two big pieces that that I know that we're missing. And maybe since you've been actually deep in the code, you've found some other pieces. I know that Hardik, Hardik's online today, also has a fork of the autoscaler that he's been getting working on top of the Gardener's machine controller manager, which is also adopting the Cluster API. And so he may have some other thoughts on other things that we're missing. And it would be great if he could look at your PR too.
Cool. So, okay, so I gather that most people have these two issues, right? So looks like, yeah, okay.
Yes, so just to add to what Robert already mentioned, right? So basically there have been quite some good amount of discussion already happened on this, and it would be really nice if we can, first settle on the open KEP, which I gave the link of it. So there are certain points that, apart from that, there are certain other things that we need to decide, that what kind of fields do we add in the either machine class or at other layers, and what kind of strategies we use for the deletion of the machines and so on. And even on top of that, if I can remember, we have issues on how do we manage the scale down to zero issues in the autoscaler, because right now they are depending on the node objects. So these are, in my opinion, there are so many gaps at the moment which needs to be addressed, first of all on the Cluster API part and on the autoscaler part. Then only the integration would be smoothly possible. So what would be nice is to address those issues first, one by one. Maybe the KEP was open, so we could probably try to push the KEP a little bit harder, and once it's done well, we can then try to do the integration well.
So currently this is not possible to delete a specific node, correct?
Yeah, at the moment it's not possible to delete a specific node. I can maybe point out the right issue which was created for that.
Okay,
And one very short comment to this cap, it's actually not open anymore because the repo got moved and all caps in the old repo got closed, but we're still open. So we should probably recreate the cap on the new repo. I don't remember the name, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Kubernetes /enhancements is where the new one's going to go. And there's a directory there called keps. So we'll stick it in there. So yes, sorry, go ahead, Olaf.
Yes, just a last point. I just posted the issue which was created for the SIMs. If you have good ideas around how can we solve this thing at the cluster API level, maybe it would be really nice if you can put some comments there on how we can resolve and how we can define a good strategy for the deletion of the machines.
Okay. Back to the, if I can talk about this machine class thing, this still contains the cloud-specific provider config. That's what Arao told me. So I'm not sure how you could potentially use this to get the node data or node template data, node info in a cloud independent way, even with machine classes.
Yes, so machine class does still contain the provider specific structure. The idea is that we would also promote fields into machine class itself that are common across all providers. Like I think the structure that the node uses is something like resource allocation. Yeah, resource allocatable. And you can fill that in with like my CPU is this, my memory is this, etc. Right? So, and then the only problem with that is if we have that field and then we have the field inside the provider spec, and it'd basically be up to the actuators to make sure that those match, right? So it would be possible to create a machine class where you put, in the part the autoscaler reads, I have 16 cores, and then put in the provider spec, I want a 4-core machine. And of course, that's not going to work very well with the autoscaler because it's going to assume that it's getting a lot more, cores than it actually will. And so we'll have to figure out how to make sure those things stay in sync. But the idea was to extract some of those common fields up so that the autoscaler could read them.
Okay.
And then we've already got things like labels and taints, which I know are other things the autoscaler is really interested in. And I think there were a couple of other fields. Again, there's a doc where we wrote down a lot of the requirements quite a while back, and we've been slowly trying to figure out sort of the right way to put them into the API.
Okay. I guess I'm not up to speed on this cap, but if this, I'll involve myself into it. Okay, thanks.
Yes, great, and it's good to know that you're encountering sort of the same problems that we have, and not lots of different ones.
Sure.
That's the good news. Okay. Did you have anything else about that, Olaf, or should we move on?
No, we can move on.
Excellent. Okay, so next, I put a link in here. Lucas created a doc. He created one last year for the 2018 roadmap for SIG cluster lifecycle. This is a link to the 2019 version of that doc. And in particular, I wanted to, there's a small section here called cluster API, where he sort of started spitballing like, his idea, or maybe Tim contributed to this too, like where we think the cluster API is going to be sort of in the next year. The reason I bring this up now is because there is a number of talks happening at KubeCon related to our SIG. The first talk is during the Contributor Summit. Tim St. Clair is going to tell the rest of the people at the Contributor Summit about sort of the state of SIG cluster lifecycle. And he's going to talk about where we've been and where we're going. And part of where we're going is the 2019 roadmap for the various different sub-projects. And then there's also a SIG intro and a cluster API deep dive. In particular, for Tim's talk at the Contributor Summit, I want to make sure that the slides that talk about where the cluster API is going sort of accurately reflect what the people that are frequently attending this meeting think should be the right direction for the project, right? So Jason and I were kind of throwing some here's some things that might go on this slide, because I think Tim was looking for help putting it together. But I did want to sort of pull people and say, where do you guys think we'll be in a year? What do you want to see happen? What are you excited to get added to the project. And I have a couple ideas, but I want to poll the group before I talk about the things that I've written down. Chris, you hit the unmute button, and I see that your mouth is moving, but I hear no words coming out. Okay, looks like Chris is going to try to rejoin.
You said that you're working on some slides. Are those available somewhere for review?
Yes, I don't know how broadly Tim has shared the slides. Let me see if I can pull up the link real quick. Let's see, it says, anyone with the link can comment. Okay, great. I will link to the specific slide that I'm talking about. There you go. I think I can hear you now, Chris.
Okay, I unmuted, so I was just like hoping somebody would say we can hear you. One of the things, or I guess the two big things that I've always kind of hoped for next year, the first one would be like working documentation for all of the cloud providers that are sort of in the same format, so that people walking up to the cluster API with different expectations for different providers kind of get the same user story. Which I think that's more of a getting there technically and then documenting that together as a group. And I think the other one is I would like for us to start moving into like, what does the reconciliation loop look like when various interesting thing happens? What happens when we try to upgrade one of our nodes? What happens when we change one of our machine sizes? How do our control loops behave in that environment? That's, I think, a good goal for us to start shooting for next year.
Other thoughts, comments?
Does the comments have to be general that's shared by all providers? Because, I mean, like, okay.
No, I certainly for this, like I want to put stuff in our meeting notes about where people think we should go. And we can, obviously not everything we say is going to make it into Tim's one slide with 5 bullet points.
Well, I can tell you from more of a company selfish standpoint that next year our focus will be on the CNI add-ons and how. I mean that I know we've talked a lot about that, but for us to actually if other projects in the company wants to adopt cluster API, that needs to be solved. Another topic that I know that it probably doesn't affect any of you guys, but we have a high interest in isolated pods, sandbox pods, as Tim Alclair from Signal would call it. I worked on a previous project on isolated containers at VMware. We built a runtime that basically does containers with wrapped in isolation of a VM. Didn't have Docker or anything in there. So we have a strong interest in isolation, and we're monitoring the sandbox pods work.
Do you see that having any sort of effect on the cluster API sort of API definition or provider implementation?
No, I think how we deploy. I mean, for that to work, we need certain runtimes installed. We need the because cluster API is going to deploy a cluster. It needs to make sure if let's say the user wants sandbox pods, then we need to be able to deploy the correct runtimes, the correct kubelet. So that is an area that we have an interest in.
Okay, so you're more talking here in sort of this context about pluggability of the deployer, so that you can put in different container runtimes or other sort of, I guess I would call them add-ons maybe, different pieces of the cluster that gets brought up so that we can customize it better for that specific environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
I definitely want to. I think that sounds great. Just to clarify, can we do that today with the machine setup config, as it were? Like, is it essentially a new script that we're running on Node Boot, or how is it different from what we have today? I guess would be the short version of that.
So I couldn't tell you because I haven't since I've joined Cluster API. My attention has been a little bit off of that world, but I know in the Tim Alclair's Sandbox pod, it's a different runtime and it requires changes to the kubelet. I can't talk about any of the stuff that we're working on, but it may require a different kubelet, may require setting up. I couldn't tell you the answer. I couldn't answer that question right now.
And you do mean a different kubelet, not just different kubelet flags and a different CRI runtime?
So the way that Tim is doing Sandbox Pod with gvisor and Kata containers, it's a little bit different from other companies' ideas out there. I was briefly involved with in the infamous virtual kubelet project. In that case, you'd need a different kubelet.
I think it's definitely something we can do better, work on next year. I think it's exciting. But yeah, it's great.
One topic I would also like to add is this currently requirement of having an initial cluster in order to be able to start your first cluster. And it'd be great if we would find some way to get rid of that.
I have something coming, so Minikube can actually run. We have all right, let's take this back. Minikube can actually run with, I think the mode is called none, where it runs in Docker. So it doesn't need a VM. I haven't tried that personally. What I've been experimenting with is running API server and etcd and the controllers themselves directly. The reason for that being that seemed to be closer to how everyone was running, or other people were actually running Cluster API. Like it seemed like everyone was relying on a pre-existing cluster. So I felt like it would be good to have all configurations use a pre-existing cluster, but maybe make that super easy. So it wasn't like you have to go set up a cluster. So I'm experimenting with that, and I'd love to collaborate with you on that. But that's sort of what I'm looking at. But that might not even be one for next year with luck.
Yeah, that was actually something that I put in the roadmap too, was thinking about ways that we can get rid of / replace Minikube or change sort of the bootstrapping flow. Because I think the Minikube bootstrapping flow is pretty convenient for maybe a developer that is sort of experimenting, but it's not necessarily a great end user experience. And it's also, as Locke has pointed out a number of times, not necessarily something that we'd sort of want to deliver to enterprise customers. So I think that's a place where we can definitely see a lot of sort of ideating around like how we can make that better. Along those same lines, Jason brought up HA last week. I think HA is something also that's sort of on the list for next year. Is if you do have an existing cluster, sort of a management cluster, as a lot of people are using to deploy, I think deploying HA underneath that isn't necessarily too difficult. But if you're starting from scratch and you just want to not have to have a cluster to create a cluster, how do you deploy an HA cluster from scratch? I think is a pretty difficult problem to solve.
So another topic I do want to bring up now that you mentioned management cluster, you mentioned last week the cluster registry. That's something that we're going to be intently looking at next year.
Cool. Yeah, so better sort of integration with the cluster registry.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll just mention a couple other things that I'd put on the slide if people haven't pulled it up. So one is, obviously getting API versions through sort of the alpha and beta process. As Tim mentioned last week, part of that is figuring out how we do conversion between different versions and sort of what the migration path for people is. I think once we have a way to move people between versions, we can start cutting versions that people can depend upon, so we can move them forward. Autoscaler integration, which came up earlier during the talk, I think that's a big thing we're going to want to solve next year, because that's, in my mind, one of the big benefits of the cluster API is you can get an autoscaler for free if you're using the cluster API. And another thing that's on my personal wish list is to get us into a place where we can use the cluster API, not just have itself. I mean, on the slide it says test and release automation. I think that could be interpreted as test and release automation for the cluster API, but to use the cluster API for Kubernetes test automation, and in particular, getting rid of kubeup and finally deleting the cluster directory from the Kubernetes repository, which has been a goal for a while. I think if you look at some of the broader themes across the SIG, it's becoming clear that people will make a change to kubeup, and that'll become part of the release notes. Is like, oh, we've switched to core DNS in 1.13, and people go like, well, what do you mean? Like, kubeadmin switched last release. When is COP switching? How is kubecorn doing it? Like, sort of tying, like, because it's part of the release and built into the Kubernetes release, it becomes part of the release notes in a way that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense anymore. And so I would love to see us both delete all that stuff so we don't have to maintain it anymore, but also move the project in a direction where that doesn't sort of default to be sort of the canonical means for us generating release notes about how you should be creating a cluster. So that's something I'm pretty excited about.
And we can still use, like, there's a bundle spec, but like some form of bundle to give the progress, or the like, not make it a lot more work, and have everyone sort of more consistent, I guess. Which doesn't require everyone to use the bundle, but I think it would be nice to let, or something bundle-esque, like, let people use that. I was actually thinking about adding bundle support to do the storage class in GCP, starting there. So
yeah, that would be great. That's why I added that add-on flag, was to like shove that in, because I was like, I need a storage class. But that's obviously an ugly way to do it, and not necessarily the way we'd like to maintain it going forward.
I want to add one more. I'm hoping that next year is when the different providers, we can start working together so that you can bundle multiple providers together, so that you can deploy clusters on multiple infrastructures.
You mean have a single cluster that spans infrastructures, or have sort of a management cluster be managing AWS cluster and a GCP cluster?
The latter.
Okay, good, because the former really scares me. I don't think it would actually work.
No. I think that if we went to KubeCon next year and we tell the audience that all of these providers are in an island to themselves, that I don't think that would be a good message.
If we use an existing cluster as the management cluster today, how close are we to that vision, as it were?
So in theory, it should work today, but what you would see is you would see a lot of errors in the controller logs for the controllers that run the actuators for a particular cloud provider, when the object is for a different provider config in it right now. So we don't handle it gracefully, but in theory, it should work today.
And that's where Ingress uses like a provider name, right? But yes, we can figure out what the right thing to do is there.
It's about quarter till, so I want to sort of wrap up on this topic. If anybody has any last thoughts, I'll give you another.
So I was going to say on the multiple provider topic in particular, this might be somewhere where we can extend kind of the webhook approach to kind of handle it as well. Instead of right now where we're deploying we would have to deploy multiple controllers that implement specific actuators. We could actually potentially leverage the webhook support so that if there is kind of common logic, that could be handled directly in a cluster API provided controller, and then the provider specific things can be managed as webhooks that interact in addition to. And then we can order the webhooks in a way that makes sense.
Yes, I think there've been a couple of proposals for us to basically bring the machine controller back into the common repo and not actually link it with the provider code. There's webhooks, there's gRPC, there are a number of ways we can sort of extract just the provider specific code out and make that sort of its own thing. And I think that would also be a great thing for us to shoot for next year, because if we could say, here is the machine controller, you run it and then you register your provider specific code, then that's a lot less code that everybody's having to maintain and keep up with and keep synced into their provider repository. So sort of solidifying that interface and making it out of process instead of in process would be awesome.
Yes, so just to add on that point, so I actually recently implemented something very similar for MCM. So it's just a separate gRPC server implementing only 3 methods: create machine, delete machine, and list machines. And even I learned from the CSI a lot of things where I'm not even providing the kubeconfig to the gRPC driver running outside. So that gRPC driver just has to, so the contract between the shared machine controller and the gRPC server is only the provider config or the provider spec. So the shared machine controller just provides the provider spec to the gRPC server, returns necessary message back, and entire logic is then in our control in the shared repository, right? I think that brings a lot of interesting benefits in different ways, because one of the things which I am seeing, which will eventually evolve in a way that the separate controllers which are going to have the kubeconfig access will start having practices of messing up with the existing machine objects and stuff like that, and machine status would be arbitrarily managed by different cloud providers, adding new messages and stuff like that. That can actually create a lot of chaos. So I implemented something like that. Maybe if you are catching up in the KubeCon, I would love to show a first-hand experience on that.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what Locke was saying about, like, if we really want to be able to run a management cluster that manages multiple environments, then the providers for those different environments have to be consistent enough that we can manage them all in the same way. And if they're all have their own machine controllers that do something vastly different with machine status, and they're treating machine status very differently, it becomes hard to sort of combine them into a single world where we can seamlessly run them sort of together. Right?
Yes.
Cool.
I do have concerns about the amount of work that will entail, and I think we can probably start with just a Go interface and vendoring and see like where the code is, like where the actual like logic is, like how much do we actually save versus like if we create a gRPC interface, it's sort of a contract, right? So it feels like it could be a lot of work. So I'm not unsupportive, but I am wary.
So this is something very similar. I just shared a link. So I was also under the impression that it could turn up to be a lot of work to have a completely new contract and so on. But I just shared link of the driver implementation which I recently started. And if you look at under the app and the package, you will see that's the only thing required to add a new cloud provider. So just and to just initiate the necessary cloud provider. That's all. So let's see. I think the KubeCon would be a very good ground to discuss this. Let's see. I can show a first-hand experience.
Great. Well, if anybody else has other thoughts about what they think we should be doing in 2019, feel free to send them to me on Slack or plus me into a comment on the meeting notes if you want them to be considered for the slide presentations that are happening next week. I'd like to move on because we're running a little bit low on time. The next question is from Jaeger, asking for good first issues to contribute. It sounds like Jaeger, are you new? Are you here? Let's see. Maybe just reading the notes. I will add some notes here. We've talked about this a couple of times in the past. If you look for issues that have the help wanted or good first issue label, That's a good place to get started. Things we mentioned earlier in this meeting about adding automated checks to our repository for things like spell checking, security scanning, etc. Those would be great things to get started because they don't require you to have any sort of context on what the code is actually doing. It's more sort of getting the repository set up, but it gets you familiar with the flow of contributing code. And will probably require you to like run through tests and actually sort of see how things fit, which will get you ready to start tackling some of the coding issues. We can always use help on things like documentation. I know that we've spent time getting the Git book put together, but there's probably lots of places if you just work through that and try things that you'll find places where you can contribute improvements to the documentation. So I think those are all great places to get started, and that will start helping build up some experience so that you know, when you see an issue like what we just discussed with moving actuators out of process, that will start to make sense, and you might start to feel like you can contribute to those sorts of things as well. Vince, it looks like you made it to somewhere with better connectivity. So can we talk about webhooks?
Yeah, let's just jump right into it. We have only 10 minutes. So I opened this umbrella issue, so just like track generic ideas. This is my understanding of it, so like it might not be the whole truth. What I would like to see, the problem that we're trying to solve is like right now, like validation and I think conversion. I've talked with Jason a little bit about how we're going to upgrade for example, the status definition later. And it seems like the conversion webhook support it in 1.13 is one way to do it. And then there is validation and mutating webhook, which I heard some philosophical talk before from Justin around the mutating and defaulting, which it would be nice. One of my proposals here would be to have a package inside the cluster API that actually like does the ordering and just like it gives like a boilerplate code for other providers to add webhooks in and make that like just plug in. So that if we ever want to change that logic, we can change it in one place and the others can update. That's kind of all I have. There's also some open questions around breaking changes or which kind do we want to prioritize.
So I think for prioritization right now, obviously we can't implement the conversion webhooks right now because the version of KubeBuilder that we're running is still on 1.11, I think. So we need to wait till we can rev that to go for the conversion webhook support. But that said, since Justin's working on defaulting within the code, I'd say adding additional validation webhooks beyond what we can do in the Open API spec would probably be the best place to start there.
Yeah, I agree. I started like a little bit to play around with like some webhook package. As I see it working, I see like that we can do some validation or defaulting inside the cluster API for everything that's generic to all the cluster API providers. And then allow, for example, well, like I've been working on the AWS one, but for example, the AWS one, we have a lot of things that like are going to config and status. And right now we're initializing, for example, nil fields or other structs like inside the code in the reconcile loop, which has been causing also some like problems between mutating objects in different, in the machine and cluster actuator. So that's something that like we could solve. Any thoughts around this?
I suspect most thoughts are going to come as implementation starts to come along because I don't think too many of us have played around with webhooks to date.
Yeah. On the idea of whether it should live in common or the controller, I think you raise a good point that the per cloud repos, I guess. I think you raise a good point that there's going to be defaulting inside the provider spec as well, and validation of the provider spec. And so we definitely need something in each per cloud repo. I think I sort of like the pattern which I think we're doing with cluster CTL, where we have like common code in the words are failing me, in the root, in the shared repo, and then we vendor it in and call into it. And I think we could probably do the same thing there, so that the defaulting and validation of the common fields, that function lives in the core project, but is then vendored in and used from the from each per cloud provider. And
So
we also have most of the,
I was going to say, I may push back a little bit on that, Justin, where it may make sense to run separate or like webhooks for the common components versus the provider-specific components as well. Just that way, instead of the cluster cuddle model seems to, in some ways, cause more harm than good. With having different versions for different things. So I think having a common shared one that way you're not having to match between the version of the webhooks that's deployed with the containers that are deployed. Those would match directly from the project versus, having to worry about moving them in step between the project and the common controllers.
Vince, you may know the answer to this, but can you put multiple validation webhooks on the same resource, or are you only allowed to register one?
No, you can. You actually also need to specify the chain, so like the order of multiple things. So my idea was to just put this logic that decides the order of things inside the cluster API upstream, and then all the providers will actually use that package. But that package will also kind of offer some, built-in validation webhooks for internal things to cluster API. They're not specific to the provider.
And do you know how the chain works? Right. So I've seen chains in the past where you can say, yes, I don't care, and no, as sort of a tertiary response to being called.
I
have 3 options.
I haven't tested it.
2. Right. So the where this came up in Kubernetes was with the authorization webhooks, where initially they just said, yes, you're allowed, or I don't know. And there was no way to say, no, you're not allowed, drop the chain. And we added that in the later version of Kubernetes, so that you could put a webhook at the beginning that would say, don't bother any of the other things in the authorization chain. I know that this should not be allowed, so we're going to stop. And hopefully that the folks that did this for CRDs saw that and learned that lesson and have a tertiary state instead of a binary state.
So that's a very good point. I'm going to add this to the umbrella just to do some exploration. I don't have the answer to that though.
I have one quick question just to be sure I understood that correctly. So it is possible to sort of force an order of multiple webhooks that validate the same thing? I know it's possible to have more than one, but I think it's not possible to order, or at least I don't know how it would be possible. Like say I want always this one webhook to be called first and then this other. Yeah.
I think you can specify like the order, but it will be kind of like sequential. That said, I don't know, to Robert's question, I don't know if like it will, for example, if you return an error message, if it will drop at the first one, or the pretty much like the chain will keep going until the end. I would suspect, for example, something for validation, I would hope that like it will just drop out of the chain as long as, like if one fails, because otherwise that would be kind of weird, at least in my opinion. But I will test that out and put my findings in the umbrella issue.
Alvaro, you're concerned that you can register multiple webhooks, but the order in which they get called is not
Random.
deterministic and maybe different for each call.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure if that's going to be a problem, but that's as far as I know. And regarding the having it continue, you can on the webhook config you can specify if the webhook is unavailable, if it should be ignored, or if it should make the request fail.
That's a very good point.
Cool. So I think takeaways, as Jason was saying, is a lot of us haven't dove deep into webhooks yet, and we need to do some reading and or experimentation. It's great that you're spearheading this, and there's some questions that we'd like to know a couple more answers for as we move forward. I think starting with something simple like validation or defaulting makes a lot of sense. The conversion stuff I expect to come later. As Jason said, we need to update some of our dependencies. We need to drop support for older versions of Kubernetes, et cetera, before we can take advantage of that. All right, and we have a minute and a half left for Chris's last agenda item, which is update on breakout session.
Yeah, I saw there was an email thread about getting together next week for KubeCon. I was wondering where we are with that and if there's any way myself or Heptio could help out.
Well, Heptio can help because Jason's driving this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I reached out. We've gotten 9 responses on the doodle so far. So if you are interested in trying to get together to talk about starting to hash out proposals for HA enablement for the Common Cluster API work, please respond to that doodle and let us know. I'm planning on taking a look through the responses at the end of the day and working with Chris to try to schedule a room within the Heptio office so that we can try to get together there. And there were some questions on the mailing list about why not during the contributor summit. And that boils down to basically, I wanted to try to be as inclusive as possible with this because I know some people aren't going to be present for the contributor summit and some people may actually be traveling that day to attend KubeCon. So I tried to find some blocks that didn't have egregious conflicts with SIG cluster lifecycle related events or meet and greets and things like that. So yeah.
Cool. Yes, thank you for putting that together. Yeah, it's unfortunate we can't find a space at the actual venue, but it sounds like the Heptio office is much closer to the venue than the Google office is. Otherwise, I'd offer a space here.
So on the getting together part, I am local to Seattle, but I will not be able to attend KubeCon. Are there folks interested in getting together on Saturday or Friday sometime? If people visiting, it would be like a social event. I don't know.
Which are you talking about, Saturday, Friday, before or after the conference?
Either.
So I know the Sunday before the conference, there's like a event as part of the Contributor Summit where people who are going to the Contributor Summit are getting together in the evening on Sunday before the conference. My guess is that since the conference ends on Thursday, a lot of people are probably flying home that Friday.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So maybe before the conference, maybe.
I guess a couple other points. Since Jason's setting this up outside of the conference, that's actually useful for you because you could come to this even if you can't go to the conference.
Yeah, so I've been ranting about this on Twitter that I ill-timed my vacation plans. So I will be traveling out of Seattle.
Okay.
So if there is an interest, it would be great to kind of meet in a social setting. If people are interested, that is.
Cool. I mean, I think the other thing is I think a lot of people on the call are based in Seattle. Maybe not a lot, but me and Chris are. And we can certainly get together outside of this if this time doesn't work for you. So
sounds good.
Cool. With that, we're 2 minutes over. So as Jason said, if you're interested, I don't think there's a way on the doodle to say that I'm interested, but I can't be there in person because I know a lot of people were interested in dialing in via Zoom. If you are interested in dialing in via Zoom, it would also be useful to fill out the doodle and maybe just shoot Jason a note saying like, I'll be remote or something. And we can sort of take that timing into account as well if you'd like to be able to at least listen in or participate. And with that, we're going to call it. Hopefully, we'll see a number of folks at KubeCon or related events next week. And otherwise, we'll be back at this meeting in 2 weeks. So talk to you guys soon.